Imagine this. Waking up one morning to find your car missing. Not just any car, but your pride and joy, locked safely in your driveway. And the kicker, it wasn't stolen by criminals. It was taken by the HOA president herself, a woman I'll call Karen. That's exactly what happened to me. I never thought the HOA could stoop this low. But this Karen? She was built different. She actually cut the heavy-duty lock on my Jeep, thinking she had the power to confiscate it. What she didn't know was that my Jeep wasn't just a normal vehicle. It was part of a police task force operation. And what followed turned into one of the biggest HOA meltdowns ever. Now, before you start thinking I'm exaggerating or trying to make the story sound more dramatic than it actually is, let me take a moment to explain exactly what kind of Jeep this was and why it mattered so much. This wasn't your typical weekend toy or flashy off-road vehicle that someone might buy to show off on Instagram or take out on a sunny Saturday drive. No, this Jeep was an entirely different beast. It was fully equipped, fortified, and authorized for official law enforcement use, something very few people in my neighborhood could even begin to comprehend. It was part of a specialized program that I was involved in, working directly alongside a police task force that handles some of the most serious and complex criminal investigations in our area. We're talking cases involving stolen vehicles that are often linked to organized crime rings, large-scale drug trafficking operations, and even covert surveillance missions that require utmost discretion and precision. At first glance, the Jeep looked completely ordinary. On the outside, it had that rugged, worn-in look that makes off-road vehicles appear like they've been through countless adventures. The tires were thick, muddy from occasional field work, and the body had a few scratches and dents that made it look like it had been through tough terrain. Anyone passing by would think it was just another Jeep owned by a weekend adventurer, ready for camping trips or off-road expeditions. Its paint wasn't shiny or flashy. It was practical and understated, blending in with the neighborhood rather than standing out. In other words, it was designed to look mundane, because that's exactly what it needed to do for undercover work. But what was hidden beneath that ordinary exterior is where the real story begins. Inside the Jeep, it was like stepping into a miniature operations center. Every inch of space was used strategically. There were hidden cameras installed in multiple locations, allowing real-time monitoring without anyone realizing it. These cameras weren't for show. They could capture license plates, faces, and activities around the vehicle, feeding directly to our secure law enforcement network. There were also encrypted radio systems that connected me instantly to the task force, ensuring that in an emergency, communication lines were open and secure. GPS tracking devices were embedded throughout the vehicle, meaning its location could be monitored at all times, which was crucial not only for operational security, but also to recover it immediately if it was ever moved without authorization. The locks were reinforced with industrial-grade security measures, making it nearly impossible for anyone to gain access without the proper key or code. This wasn't just a Jeep. It was a mobile command center, an official piece of government property entrusted to me for very serious and often dangerous work. Every tool, device, and modification had a purpose: to protect the integrity of ongoing investigations, to safeguard sensitive information, and to ensure the safety of everyone involved in our operations. If anyone had touched it without permission, they weren't just breaking neighborhood rules, they were tampering with law enforcement property, which is a serious federal offense. That's why what happened next with Karen, the HOA president, would become even more dramatic, because she had no idea the magnitude of what she was dealing with. Even the placement of items inside the Jeep had been carefully thought out. Equipment cases were strategically stowed to allow rapid access in case of an emergency, while surveillance devices were hidden so well that even a trained eye would struggle to notice them. The Jeep could be used in undercover operations, stakeouts, and field surveillance, and it had the capacity to gather and store critical evidence without attracting attention. Every detail, from the reinforced steering column to the tamper-proof storage compartments, was designed to make it resilient against theft or interference. This was not just about protecting a vehicle. It was about protecting law enforcement operations that could have a direct impact on public safety. So, when I say this Jeep wasn't just a normal vehicle, I'm not exaggerating. The fact that Karen, the HOA president, cut the lock and attempted to take it didn't just violate neighborhood rules. It crossed a line into criminal interference with law enforcement operations. She had no idea what she had in her hands, and her arrogance blinded her to the risk she was taking. In her mind, she was enforcing HOA rules, but in reality, she had just walked straight into a legal and operational nightmare that would quickly spiral out of control, setting the stage for one of the most unbelievable neighborhood showdowns I've ever witnessed. This Jeep was more than metal and electronics. It was a symbol of authority, responsibility, and trust. It represented countless hours of planning, coordination, and dedication to protecting the community from crimes most people never see. And that's why what Karen did wasn't just a petty HOA dispute. It was a direct challenge to law enforcement, one that she would soon regret in ways she could never have imagined. Karen, the HOA president, hated it from the very first moment she saw the Jeep parked in my driveway. Her reaction wasn't subtle or even polite. She made it very clear that she thought the vehicle was an eyesore, a blight on the carefully curated appearance of our neighborhood. In her mind, the Jeep was offensive simply because it didn't conform to the image she wanted to enforce, a vision that revolved around manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and acceptable cars that looked like they belonged in a magazine advertisement rather than a law enforcement operation. She repeatedly told me that it looked ugly and brought down property values, as if my legally parked vehicle could somehow devalue every house on the block. She didn't stop there. Her accusations escalated quickly. Karen even insinuated that I was operating some kind of shady business from my garage, as if the Jeep's presence implied that criminal activity was happening right under her nose. She sent me passive-aggressive notes, implying that my vehicle was a public nuisance, a hazard, and a danger to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood, all while smirking like she was delivering some righteous judgment. I tried to reason with her, explaining over and over that the Jeep was fully authorized, legally parked, and absolutely within my rights. I reminded her that it wasn't just any vehicle. It was part of a police task force operation, equipped with sensitive equipment and monitored by law enforcement. I offered to provide proof, documentation, and even official authorization letters to demonstrate that I was in full compliance with the law. But Karen refused to listen. Her obsession was no longer rational. It had become deeply personal. She ignored facts, dismissed legalities, and treated my explanations as if they were meaningless. In her eyes, the Jeep's presence alone was a threat to her sense of control, a violation of the authority she thought she wielded over our neighborhood. Her reaction escalated further. Karen didn't just make verbal complaints or send polite emails. She launched a full-scale campaign of intimidation and harassment. She started leaving increasingly hostile letters on my door, each one more aggressive than the last. Some were typed, others were handwritten in shaky, angry scrawl, but all shared a common theme. My Jeep had to go, or there would be consequences. She threatened fines that could climb into hundreds, even thousands of dollars. She warned that failure to comply would result in citations, potential legal action, or other punitive measures. And she didn't stop at letters. She started calling emergency HOA meetings solely focused on my Jeep, bringing up my property at gatherings where the topic had no legitimate place. She enlisted other members of the HOA, spreading rumors and attempting to paint me as someone in violation of neighborhood rules, even though I was completely within my rights. To Karen, this wasn't about rules or aesthetics anymore. It had become a personal vendetta. She wasn't simply enforcing HOA guidelines. She was waging a campaign to humiliate and remove me. Every glance I gave the Jeep seemed to provoke her. Every casual conversation about my vehicle with neighbors turned into a complaint she filed with the HOA board. She monitored my driveway as if she were a security guard patrolling a high-risk facility, keeping track of who visited, what times I drove the Jeep, and even noting if it was parked slightly askew. Her obsession grew so extreme that it began to affect her relationships with other neighbors. People would joke about Karen watching the Jeep, or whisper about the lengths she would go to enforce her self-imposed authority. The intimidation tactics continued for weeks. She escalated her actions from passive-aggressive letters to formal violation notices, claiming I was disturbing the peace and creating a neighborhood nuisance. Every time I tried to explain the truth, she twisted my words, presenting them as evidence of wrongdoing to the HOA board. She even attempted to block me from participating in HOA meetings, claiming that I was disruptive and not respecting community standards. Her vendetta had reached the point where it was no longer about the Jeep. It was about demonstrating her power and forcing me to bend to her will. She wanted the Jeep gone, and she didn't care what it took to make it happen. Karen's obsession wasn't just a series of petty complaints. It became a psychological pressure campaign. Every day, I would find some new letter, a new flyer, or a new meeting notice focused entirely on my Jeep. Neighbors who were once friendly became hesitant to talk to me, worried about getting caught in her crossfire. The situation was exhausting and stressful, but it also revealed the true nature of her personality. She wasn't concerned with fairness, legality, or reason. She was consumed by control, by ego, by a need to assert dominance over anyone who dared defy her vision of the neighborhood. And the Jeep, innocent and stationary as it was, had become her ultimate target. By the time it escalated to the point of her cutting the lock, the situation had been building for months. Every interaction, every letter, every emergency meeting was a brick in the foundation of a conflict that was about to explode. Karen's hatred for the Jeep, her obsession with enforcing arbitrary rules, and her refusal to acknowledge facts or authority created a perfect storm. She had made the Jeep a legally authorized, fully equipped law enforcement vehicle, her personal nemesis, and in doing so, she set herself up for the dramatic consequences that were about to unfold. Then came the breaking point, the moment when the entire situation escalated from a tense neighborhood dispute into a full-blown nightmare. It was late at night, quiet except for the occasional sound of distant cars or a dog barking somewhere down the street. I had just finished settling in for the evening, thinking about nothing more than relaxing after a long day. Suddenly, I heard some faint clanging noises outside. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe someone was moving garbage cans, or a neighbor was tinkering with their car, or perhaps it was just the wind rattling something against a fence. The sounds were intermittent and not particularly loud, so I didn't give it much thought. I went back to my routine, assuming it was just normal neighborhood noise. But the next morning, everything changed in an instant. I walked outside to start my day, expecting to see my Jeep exactly where I had left it, the rugged, dependable vehicle I had relied on for months. And then my heart dropped and my stomach sank. The Jeep was gone. Completely gone. At first, I couldn't even process it. My mind raced. Was it stolen? Had someone broken in during the night? I felt a surge of panic mixed with disbelief. I ran to inspect the driveway, hoping that somehow it had been moved a few feet or hidden behind a bush as a prank. But no, the driveway was empty, except for the faint scuff marks in the dirt where the tires had been. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The thick chain I had carefully wrapped around the tires to secure the Jeep had been cut clean through. Whoever had taken it hadn't even bothered to unlock it. They had forcibly destroyed my security measures. My first thought was that this was a professional job. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. My panic shifted into fury. Who could have done this? Who would have the audacity to come onto my property in the dead of night and take my Jeep without permission? And then I saw it, a small, smug note sitting neatly on my porch, as if it were a trophy or a calling card. I picked it up, my hand shaking with anger and disbelief. The note was written in sharp, precise handwriting and signed by none other than Karen, the HOA president. The words on that tiny piece of paper hit me like a punch in the gut. Per HOA rules, unauthorized vehicles will be towed. Consider this a warning. A warning? My mind reeled. She didn't tow it, she stole it. She had cut through my security, removed my Jeep from my property, and left me a note as if to say, "You've been warned, and I'm in charge." The audacity was staggering. Every sentence, every word in that note screamed arrogance, entitlement, and total disregard for the law. Karen had crossed every line imaginable, transforming a neighborhood disagreement into a criminal act. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I needed to think rationally, but it was impossible. My Jeep wasn't just a car. It was a fully equipped law enforcement vehicle, packed with sensitive equipment, surveillance tools, and government-authorized devices. The implications of her actions were enormous. Whoever had taken it, Karen, in her obsessive mission to enforce HOA rules, had just interfered with a police task force operation. She didn't know it, but she had committed a major offense. And the realization of this fact sent a shiver down my spine. I began to retrace my steps mentally, trying to figure out how she could have done it. There was no sign of forced entry into my garage. She hadn't even tried to access the vehicle legally. She had simply come onto my property, cut through a reinforced chain, and driven away with something she had no right to touch. And the note? The note was the cherry on top, the perfect example of her arrogance and her belief that she was untouchable. It was as if she thought that because she held a position in the HOA, she had authority over anything she deemed unsightly or in violation. Anger bubbled inside me, mixing with disbelief and a growing sense of determination. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just shrug it off as a misunderstanding or a neighborhood squabble. This was beyond petty disputes about property lines or paint colors. Karen had gone too far, and now the consequences of her actions were about to unfold. As I stood there, staring at the empty driveway, my mind raced with questions. How had she managed to remove the Jeep without being noticed? Had she called someone for help? Did she think she could get away with this without repercussions? And most importantly, how was I going to get it back? The situation was escalating rapidly, and I realized that this wasn't just about a Jeep anymore. It was about justice, accountability, and exposing the true limits of HOA authority when confronted with real legal power. Every detail of that morning was etched into my memory. The clanging sounds of the previous night, the emptiness of the driveway, the shredded chain, and that smug note. It was all a stark reminder of Karen's obsession and her complete lack of understanding about who she had targeted. In her mind, this was a victory, a demonstration of control over the neighborhood. In reality, she had crossed a line that would come back to haunt her in ways she could never anticipate. The moment I realized my Jeep was gone, I knew I had to act fast. This wasn't just about a stolen vehicle. It was a fully equipped law enforcement asset, packed with sensitive equipment, surveillance tools, and GPS tracking devices. I immediately called my task force contact, someone I've worked with for years and trusts me implicitly. The moment I explained what had happened, there was no hesitation, no questions about the legality of intervening. They understood the seriousness of the situation instantly. Within minutes, the quiet suburban streets of our neighborhood were no longer quiet. Unmarked police cruisers began appearing from side streets, their drivers moving cautiously but efficiently, communicating over radios with precision that left no room for error. Officers positioned themselves strategically, taking up vantage points near entrances, exits, and corners of the neighborhood. It looked like a scene straight out of a crime procedural show, except it was happening right in front of my house. Karen, of course, had no idea what was about to hit her. She thought she was in control. What she didn't realize was that the Jeep had a sophisticated tracking system installed, a device connected directly to the task force's network. Every move the vehicle made after it left my driveway was being logged in real time. The system could calculate its exact location, speed, and even monitor certain environmental conditions inside the vehicle. For Karen, who had naively cut the lock and taken it without considering consequences, this meant she was already being watched the moment the Jeep left my property. The police traced its location quickly, and to everyone's surprise, it was sitting in the HOA's community storage lot, completely exposed, right where Karen thought no one would notice. She hadn't even bothered to hide it or make it appear legitimate. It was almost comical how brazen and careless she had been, but that carelessness would soon cost her dearly. When the officers arrived at the storage lot, the scene was nothing short of cinematic. Karen was there, standing in front of the Jeep, like a queen guarding her treasure, her posture proud and her expression smug, arms crossed over her chest. She had the kind of confidence only someone who thinks they are untouchable can muster. She puffed out her chest and gave a self-satisfied smirk, ready to deliver a lecture about enforcing HOA rules and how she had taken care of the problem car. To her, she was the hero of the neighborhood, a vigilant enforcer of her own brand of justice. She had no concept that her actions were not only reckless but illegal. The officers approached with calm precision, forming a semicircle around her, making it clear that the game had changed. For the first time, Karen's smile wavered, a flicker of unease crossing her face. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. The problem car she had stolen was not just any vehicle. It was government property under active surveillance. The smugness that had defined her posture moments ago was being replaced by panic. Her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape route, her mind racing for some excuse that could explain her actions. But there was no excuse. Her plan had been amateurish from the start, and now the consequences were closing in fast. The officers were calm, professional, and deliberate in their approach. They didn't yell, they didn't threaten. They let the presence of authority speak for itself. Their eyes met hers with a mixture of firmness and patience, signaling that they had all the control. Meanwhile, the surrounding neighborhood began to notice the sudden activity. Curious neighbors peeked through blinds, and some cautiously stepped outside, their phones already recording what was unfolding. The aura of power that Karen had relied on, the illusion of control she wielded over the HOA, was evaporating in real time. The air seemed charged with tension as bystanders watched a normally overconfident HOA president confronted by real law enforcement officers. Karen tried to maintain some sense of composure. She raised a hand as if to explain, as if to say, "Wait, you don't understand." But the officers didn't flinch. One of them calmly stated her name and began listing the violations she had committed: tampering with law enforcement property, theft, and obstruction of a police operation. Her lips moved, forming words that were barely audible, stammering excuses, pleas about HOA rules, claims that she didn't know, that she was just enforcing neighborhood standards. But none of it mattered. The officers were trained to deal with ignorance and arrogance alike, and it was obvious they weren't impressed by her attempts to justify her actions. For the first time, Karen looked around and realized she wasn't just facing a few neighbors or a powerless HOA board. She was surrounded by the law. Her chest tightened, her posture slumped slightly, and that once untouchable smirk disappeared entirely. Her confidence had crumbled in seconds. Every step she had taken to assert control over my property and punish me had led directly to this moment. Public humiliation, legal jeopardy, and the unmistakable presence of authority that she could no longer ignore or control. It was a pivotal moment, the kind that changes people's perceptions forever. Karen had thought herself untouchable, above the law in her little HOA kingdom. But the reality of real authority, real law enforcement, and real consequences hit her like a tidal wave. And all the while, the Jeep sat silently behind her, its presence a reminder of the power she had underestimated, the very power she had foolishly tried to challenge. This confrontation was only the beginning of the fallout, and Karen had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her arrogance would be. The lead officer approached with calm authority, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he closed the distance between Karen and the law. Every movement was deliberate, professional, and measured. He stopped just a few feet in front of her, maintaining eye contact that conveyed both seriousness and control. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly enough for the small crowd of neighbors who had begun to gather to hear. "Ma'am," he said, his tone steady but firm, "do you realize you've tampered with government property?" The words landed like a hammer. Karen, who had spent weeks building her persona as the untouchable HOA enforcer, initially didn't grasp the weight of what he had said. She blinked, her smirk flickering, and then, almost reflexively, she laughed. "Government property," she scoffed, tossing her head back as if the idea itself were absurd. "No, this is an eyesore that violates my HOA rules. I don't care whose it is." Her voice was loud, brash, dripping with arrogance. She waved her hands toward the Jeep, standing proudly, or so she thought, behind her, as if her personal opinion about aesthetics somehow gave her the authority to override the law. She clearly believed that her status as HOA president gave her carte blanche to enforce her vision of neighborhood perfection, even if it meant interfering with private property or, in this case, something far more serious. Her laughter echoed faintly against the neighboring houses, a sound that would soon turn into a memory of humiliation. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he signaled to a colleague, who discreetly began recording the interaction for evidence. Then he continued, his words slower this time, deliberate, designed to make her understand the gravity of her actions. "Ma'am, this vehicle is not just a personal car. It is part of an active task force operation. It contains law enforcement equipment, surveillance tools, and is protected by federal statutes. What you have done constitutes tampering with government property. At this, Karen's entire demeanor shifted. Her eyes widened, her jaw dropping slightly in disbelief. For the first time, she seemed to grasp, at least partially, the severity of what she had done. Her previous arrogance, the confidence she had worn like armor, began to crack under the weight of reality. She stumbled over her words, attempting to backtrack with a weak protest. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. I was following HOA bylaws. I didn't think." But the officers were unmoved. Ignorance, they made clear, does not erase a crime. They calmly explained the legal implications of her actions. Cutting the reinforced lock, entering private property, and moving a government vehicle without authorization was not a minor HOA violation or a civil matter. It was tampering with law enforcement equipment, and depending on intent and jurisdiction, it could even be classified as theft of government property. They spelled it out carefully, ensuring she understood that this was far beyond the petty fines and meetings she was accustomed to imposing. "This is not a warning," the lead officer said sternly. "This is a felony. Your actions have serious legal consequences." Karen's face paled slightly as she tried to reconcile what she had thought was a minor HOA enforcement action with the reality of federal law. The words felony and tampering with government property echoed in her mind. She had never imagined that her obsession with aesthetics and control could escalate to this level. The neighbors watching through windows and fences were equally stunned. What had begun as a local dispute about a vehicle had now transformed into a dramatic confrontation with law enforcement. The officer continued, calmly laying out the charges that could be filed against her: tampering with government property, obstruction of a police operation, and theft of government property. Each one was serious on its own. Combined, they represented criminal exposure that could lead to fines, probation, or even jail time. Karen's earlier bravado had completely vanished. She was now the personification of disbelief, her mind racing to grasp how her actions had spiraled out of control. Every letter she had sent, every meeting she had called, every threat she had issued, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the legal storm looming over her. Her attempts at justification faltered further. She tried to invoke the HOA bylaws again, waving her hands as if the rules of her self-created kingdom could somehow shield her from federal law. But the officers were clear. HOA bylaws have no power over federal property. No amount of neighborhood politics, no self-imposed authority, no belief in moral rightness could override the law. Karen had thought she was untouchable, but in that moment, the truth became undeniable. She had crossed a line she couldn't come back from. As the conversation continued, a mixture of tension, disbelief, and quiet awe settled over the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered. They could see Karen, once confident and domineering, now caught in a web of consequences far larger than anything she had imagined. The Jeep sat behind her silently, a stark symbol of authority she had foolishly underestimated. Its mere presence reinforced the severity of her mistake. She had not only violated HOA norms, but had directly interfered with law enforcement operations. The officers made it clear that there would be no leniency, no negotiation, no excuses. This was a legal matter, and it would be handled according to the rules of law, not the whims of a self-proclaimed HOA queen. In that moment, Karen's world shifted. Her laughter, arrogance, and overconfidence had all evaporated, replaced by fear, confusion, and the dawning realization that she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. The officers remained calm but firm, surrounding her and securing the area, ensuring that this incident would end with accountability, not chaos. For the neighbors, it was a lesson in power, law, and the limits of local authority. For Karen, it was the beginning of a reckoning that would redefine her understanding of control, legality, and humility. As soon as the officers made their presence fully known, the quiet suburban neighborhood transformed into something out of a dramatic TV show. Curious neighbors began emerging from their homes, peeking out of windows, stepping cautiously onto driveways, and even parking their cars nearby to get a better view. Almost immediately, phones were pulled out, cameras started rolling, and social media notifications buzzed as people began documenting the unfolding drama. What had started as a private dispute between me and the HOA president had become a full-blown spectacle, visible not just to the small crowd that gathered in person, but potentially to hundreds, if not thousands, online. The hum of excitement, murmurs of astonishment, and the occasional gasp filled the air as Karen, once the confident, bossy, self-assured queen of the neighborhood, stood frozen, suddenly aware that everyone was watching. Her demeanor, which had previously been sharp, commanding, and dripping with arrogance, started to crumble in real time. Her tone, once bossy and confident, now wavered, and desperation crept in like a slow, cold shadow. She tried to regain control, waving her hands, speaking quickly, and attempting to explain herself, but every word came out frantic and unconvincing. Her usual sharp rebuttals and pointed criticisms were replaced with stammers, awkward pauses, and nervous gestures. She even attempted to pivot her narrative, casting herself as the victim rather than the perpetrator. "I'm just a concerned citizen," she protested, her voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. She tried to make it sound like she had acted out of civic duty, as though confiscating a fully equipped law enforcement vehicle in the dead of night could somehow be justified as protecting property values or neighborhood aesthetics. But the officers were not buying it, not for a second. Their expressions remained calm but stern, their posture unyielding, and their eyes locked on her with a quiet authority that immediately made it clear who held the power. Every attempt she made to rationalize her actions, every desperate plea about HOA rules or concern for appearances, fell flat. They reminded her firmly that she had crossed multiple legal lines, tampering with government property, theft, and interfering with law enforcement operations. In that moment, Karen's illusions of power dissolved completely. She could no longer pretend that the HOA bylaws she had so zealously enforced gave her any authority over federal property or law enforcement personnel. With precision and control, the officers moved in. Handcuffs were brought out, and in front of the crowd of neighbors who had now fully gathered around, Karen was placed under arrest. Her struggles were minimal, more out of shock and disbelief than actual resistance, as the realization sank in that this was no HOA meeting dispute, no minor fine, no small reprimand. This was real legal accountability. Imagine it. The self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, the woman who spent months dictating rules, writing threatening letters, and calling emergency meetings, now being led away in handcuffs for stealing a Jeep. The irony was so thick it was almost tangible. Neighbors whispered to each other, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads in amazement, all of them capturing video clips that would later serve as a record of the dramatic downfall. And the best part, the Jeep itself was a silent witness to the entire crime. Thanks to the surveillance cameras installed inside, every single action Karen took, from the moment she cut through the thick, reinforced lock to the moment she drove the vehicle off my property and into the HOA storage lot, was recorded in crystal-clear video. Every angle, every gesture, every blink of disbelief or smugness was captured. The cameras provided undeniable evidence of tampering, theft, and unauthorized operation of government property. Even attempts at manipulation or excuses were documented visually, leaving no room for argument or ambiguity. The footage would later serve as the cornerstone of legal action against her, making it impossible for her to downplay the severity of her actions or misrepresent the events in any way. The scene was surreal. Karen's previous aura of dominance and intimidation had vanished entirely. Instead of a commanding presence, she now appeared vulnerable, exposed, and utterly powerless. The crowd, once intimidated by her authority, now watched with a mix of astonishment, satisfaction, and schadenfreude. The act of leading her away in handcuffs was not just a moment of justice, it was a public display of accountability, a reminder that arrogance and self-righteousness cannot override the law. The Jeep, parked silently behind the officers, stood as a symbol of the limits of HOA authority, and as a stark reminder of what happens when someone underestimates the consequences of tampering with something far beyond their jurisdiction. Neighbors continued filming, sharing videos across social media, making the event not just a neighborhood scandal, but a viral lesson in humility and the rule of law. Each recording captured Karen's expressions, her desperate attempts to rationalize her actions, and the calm efficiency of the officers enforcing justice. Her story would now be shared widely, not as a tale of HOA authority, but as a cautionary example of what happens when personal obsession and disregard for the law collide. The footage from the Jeep's cameras combined with neighbor videos created a complete narrative that left no doubt. Karen had overstepped, underestimated the law, and ultimately faced the consequences in the most public and undeniable way possible. By the time the officers had finished their procedures and led her to the cruiser, the crowd was buzzing with conversation, excitement, and amazement. Phones still recording, neighbors discussing what had just happened, and whispers of disbelief filled the street. The humiliation was total, the justice clear, and the narrative complete. Karen, who once ruled the HOA with a mix of fear and intimidation, had been exposed, restrained, and documented committing a serious crime. And all of it, every single moment, had been captured on video, ensuring that there would be no revisionist version of events. It was a perfect storm of accountability, justice, and the sweet satisfaction of seeing arrogance collide with law enforcement reality. In the end, the fallout for Karen was nothing short of catastrophic. What she had brushed off as just enforcing HOA rules turned into a legal avalanche that crushed her carefully constructed image of power and authority. The charges were not small, not negotiable, and certainly not the kind of slap on the wrist she had grown accustomed to handing out to her neighbors. No, these were serious, career-ending, reputation-shattering accusations, destruction of property, theft, and interference with police operations. Each one carried weight, both in the legal system and in the court of public opinion. And when combined, they painted a picture of someone who wasn't a leader, but a reckless, arrogant bully who had finally gone too far. The HOA board, who had always stood behind her bluster, had no choice but to back away. For years, Karen had been their loudest voice, their enforcer, their self-appointed queen who reveled in micromanaging people's lawns, decorations, and even the color of their curtains. But now she was toxic. Supporting her would mean implicating the entire HOA in her crime, and legally, they had zero ground to stand on. They tried to spin it at first, saying they had no knowledge of her actions, that she had acted alone. And for once, the neighbors actually believed them, because Karen's obsession with control was legendary. It was entirely believable that she had taken this insane leap on her own. But here's where it got even sweeter. The very community she had ruled with an iron fist turned against her. Neighbors who had once cowered under her glare or quietly paid her unfair fines now saw an opening. They whispered, they gathered, and soon enough, they started petitioning to remove her as HOA president altogether. The same woman who had demanded power at every board meeting, who strutted around calling herself the voice of the neighborhood, was now being voted out by the very people she thought she controlled. Petitions were signed not just out of anger, but out of relief. Relief that someone had finally stood up to her, and that the law had stepped in where homeowners felt powerless. As for me, my outcome couldn't have been more different. I got my Jeep back that very same day, completely unharmed, thanks to the reinforced design and the police recovering it so quickly. Not a single piece of equipment was missing. The cameras had done their job. The GPS tracker had done its job. And the task force officers made it clear I wouldn't have to pay a single cent for recovery. Karen's little stunt had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. She hadn't towed away an eyesore. She had stolen evidence of her own arrogance, and now the entire thing was on record. Karen, meanwhile, was drowning. Between attorney fees, fines, potential restitution, and the humiliation of being arrested in front of her own neighbors, she was looking at thousands upon thousands of dollars in losses. And that wasn't even counting the social cost. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk down the block, every interaction at community events was now laced with whispers and side glances. The queen bee had been dethroned, and the sting of her downfall was something she couldn't find her way out of. The lesson here is simple, but powerful. Some people think HOA power is real power. They strut around with their rule books, waving bylaws like they're weapons, acting as if a neighborhood committee gives them the authority of kings and queens. But that's not how the world works. Real power lies in the law, in accountability, in knowing the difference between rules and rights. Karen thought she could blur that line, that her title gave her the ability to bend reality. But when she crossed into messing with government property, she wasn't a president anymore. She wasn't even just a nuisance. She was a criminal. And that's the thing about arrogance. It digs its own grave. Karen didn't need me to take her down. Didn't need some elaborate plan or revenge plot. All I had to do was let her arrogance run wild. Her obsession with control, her need to dominate, her inability to admit she was wrong. All of that pushed her right over the edge. And when she fell, she didn't just trip. She plummeted, dragging her reputation, her finances, and her imaginary power down with her. So the next time you hear about an HOA trying to bully someone, whether it's over paint colors, a garden gnome, or where you park your car, remember this story. Sometimes the best revenge isn't a fight. It isn't shouting or arguing or even suing. Sometimes the sweetest justice is simply standing back and letting people like Karen show the world who they really are. Because eventually, arrogance exposes itself. And when it does, it doesn't just bruise, it destroys.